When it comes to turn-based strategy games, it's almost impossible to find a more well-known and beloved franchise as Sid Meier's Civilization. It single-handedly created a video game phenomenon known as one more turn, the bane of every adult gamer with actual responsibilities, and to this day it's regarded as one of the most important, popular, and overall best game franchise of all time. Looking at its release cycle and rather conventional method of simply numbering the sequels, one might think that this particular series had a stable and uneventful history behind its creation. Well, one could not be more wrong. In fact, the history of Sid Meier's Civilization is filled with lawsuits, license controversies, and the all good cliché of the big bad company not realizing the golden goose they had in front of them the whole time. Ladies and gentlemen, I hereby present the history of Civilization. The video game, not the entirety of humankind, at least not today. It all started in the early 1950s in France. An up-and-coming movie director named Albert Lamourise has conceived an idea for a strategy board game called La Conquête du Monde, which he patented in 1954. Sometime later, a French game publisher, Meier, bought the copyrights of the game and had a professional designer, Jean-Ren Vernet, improve it. 2 years later, it was bought by a company called Parker Brothers and released worldwide under the title Risk the Continental game. Despite technically being a board game, this was a very important achievement in the yet non-existent field of video games for a simple reason. Early video game designers had no predecessors that would build any foundations on how to create this particular type of media, so they had to draw inspiration from some other source. And the closest form of media that was already established in consumers' minds were board games. And one of the most popular board game in America was the aforementioned Risk. It inspired a young college student named Walter Bright to create a computer game called Empire in 1977. Although at the time he made the game available commercially, he was only able to sell 2 copies. It was coded on a computer in California Institute of Technology. At some point, somebody breached the security of this college and stole some data, including the source code of Bright's game. This code was passed from person to person, being slowly modified by every consecutive owner. At some point, it ended up in the hands of Herb Jacobs and Dave Mitten, who submitted it to Decus, a large users group. Thanks to that, the game came pre-packaged with DEC computers, as some programs from this user group did. This allowed the game to gain significant popularity, and just like Risk, it went on to become a source of inspiration for many future developers. One of them was Sidney Key Meier, a computer programmer specializing in developing cash register systems for department stores. In 1981, he bought his first personal computer, Atari 800. On it, he quickly started to code simple games, mostly spoofs of other titles such as Pac-Man or Space Invaders. However, as he was more of an indoor person, he didn't have the skills necessary to properly advertise them. He was only able to sell about 5 or 10 copies in his local computer store. But this was about to change, as Meier's game developing skills attracted a retired fighter pilot named Bill Steely. At the time, they both worked for a company called General Instruments, and thanks to that, had some mutual friends. Those friends, knowing of their interest in aviation, arranged a meeting between the two, during which Meier repeatedly defeated Steely in an arcade game called Red Baron. When asked how did he do it, Meier explained that he had analyzed the game's programming to predict future actions and claimed that he could design a better one in 1 week. But this was not what truly interested Steely. What really piqued his interests were Meier's plans to create a flight simulator for Atari computers, and as a die-hard fanatic of air combat, Steely proposed to make a company that would sell Meier's game. And so, Microprose Software was founded in 1982. Their first game, Hellcat Ace, sold a whopping 50 copies shortly after its release, proving to both gentlemen that their video game business was a step in the right direction. After 4 short years, the company made $10 million in sales alone, proving that video game business was not only a step, but a leap to the moon of right directions. Microprose was pumping out dozens of new games thanks to Sid Meier's incredible game-making skills. They were, however, very similar to one another, as almost every Microprose production was either a vehicle or war simulator. This made sense from a business perspective. After all, it was thanks to this genre that the company was doing so well. But Sid Meier grew tired of making the same type of game over and over. So in 1986, along with a fellow Microprose designer Arnold Hendrick, he set out to create a role-playing adventure title, but Bill Steely didn't like the idea. He wanted more vehicle games, thinking that a different genre will not sell well. Thankfully, the company got over this problem with the help of none other than Robin Williams, yes, the Robin Williams, who suggested during a friendly meeting over dinner to make Sid Meier's name a selling point of their next game. This way, even if Microprose's next title would stray from what the company was known for, it would still have a familiar name attached to it, acting as a seal of quality. This led to the birth of a game called Sid Meier's Pirates, and from this point on, every risky title Microprose made would have Sid's name attached to it. However, most of the repertoire would still mostly consist of vehicle simulators. In 1988, Meier was working on a game called F-19 Stealth Fighter. During this process, he met a man named Bruce Shelley, an experienced board game designer who migrated to the video game development scene. Meier saw F-19 Stealth Fighter as his magnum opus of sorts, at least when it came to the vehicle games, putting everything he could into this project. So naturally, he wanted to try something new afterwards. He was particularly impressed by the growing popularity of so-called God games, which showed him how much fun players could derive from building something instead of destroying it. Along with Bruce Shelley, he started working on 2 new projects, one of them being a conventional action title called Covert Action, and the other being his first dive into the God game genre, Sid Meier's Railroad Tycoon. The latter was finished and released in 1990, garnering favorable reviews and selling 400,000 copies. Despite that, Bill Steely was not happy with the game as it did not fit the company's repertoire. So, once Meier and Shelley had started work on a sequel to Railroad Tycoon, Steely immediately cancelled the project.
Into Microprose and meet the people.
Having a good time, huh?
Well, hi Claire, how are you? This is Microprose software and our wonderful administrative staff. That's Claire. And this is Toby. Hi Toby, how are you doing? And now let's go in and meet Wild Bill Staley, president of Microprose. Hi Bill.
Hi, how are you today?
Just fine. I wondered if you'd like to give us a tour of the Microprose facilities.
I think that'd be a great idea so all our friends out there can get a feel of what we do at Microprose. This
Great.
is my wonderful office, and you can tell we're in the
While working together, Meier and Shelley slowly got to know each other better. And as it turned out, both of them were big fans of the aforementioned Empire game. During one conversation, Meier asked Shelley for 10 things he'd change about the game, to which Shelley offered a list of a dozen. Meier's response? Dropping a single floppy disk on Shelley's desk with the very first playable version of Civilization. And so the die was cast. Meier started coding the game on his own, with Shelley serving as a producer who would play it mid-development and offer his advice on what to improve. No one else was allowed to play it during production, simply because Meier felt it was not ready. The first prototype was very similar to SimCity, only instead of taking care of one town, the player would oversee the growth of an entire country. However, this version, according to Sid, was not very fun, and neither of the 2 developers had any idea how to change it.
So we have this phrase, which is the valley of despair, that every project seems to go through this valley of despair, like halfway through, this game is not fun, nobody likes it, I can't figure out how to make this work, it's not working, nobody likes me, I don't know, nobody will talk to me, this is terrible. Civ went through that in the kind of transition between the real-time version and the turn-based version. So our first approach to this grand topic of civilization was inspired a lot by SimCity, the idea of zoning part of your map to build a new city, maybe creating a zone over here for farmers, and having everything happen in a kind of a real-time process where you watched it gradually grow, and now you're ready to zone this. Maybe you want to zone this area for mining, and you kind of do these things in the first prototypes that we created. You do these things and kind of sit back and watch it kind of happen, and that was kind of okay, but it really didn't engage you as much as we really felt the game needed to. So we actually put that prototype away for a while.
Meanwhile, Bill Steely was getting anxious, as strategy games were not too profitable on the video game market, and Sid's new title, yet again, did not fit the company's status quo. So he put the production on hold and told Meier to finish his work on covert action. Coincidentally, this break in development allowed the programmer to re-evaluate the project, leading him to scrap the real-time SimCity-like gameplay in favor of a turn-based one. Thanks to that, the project started to take a new direction. Meier found a new inspiration in the Risk board game and, based on it, he added the concepts of war and military units into the game. Another source of ideas for the programmer were children's history books, which led him to conceiving the concept of a technology tree, which coincidentally was first introduced in a board game of the same title.
The idea for a tech tree, which I think was unique and original to Civilization, came from a book that I was looking at. This one had kind of a timeline of history in it, where it would lay out different political advancements or social policies or military things. And I went kind of with my yellow marker, went through that book and said, okay, bronze working is here, iron working, gunpowder. That almost became the template for the tech tree, and it just felt like a very easy to understand mechanism for showing the player how things are connected, giving them kind of an insight into the future, giving them goals and things to look forward to. Two steps down the tech tree, I can get to this. And it felt like just something to very much hang the structure of the game on. That's something that would start simple and again grow and grow and grow as you got further and further into the game.
But as some concepts were introduced, others were dropped as they simply did not work in the game's favor. Multiplayer alliances, minefields, minesweepers, jets and helicopters were all scrapped from the final version. But the most interesting feature that never saw the light of day was the online multiplayer. Why? Well, as Sid Meier put it, if you had friends, you wouldn't need to play computer games. At this point, the game was almost done. Meier and Shelley presented the project to the rest of Microprose in hopes of getting the required help with publishing the game, but were met with yet another obstacle. See, the new vice president of the company got more money for games that were not created by Sid Meier for some reason, and therefore he purposefully kept the needed resources away from Meier. This led him and Shelley to seek help on their own, including artists who would finish the game's freaking artwork.
An early version of our intro sequence. This is really something we did to make this game feel epic. These are all kind of temporary graphics that I did with deep paint, and finally hired a real artist to eventually replace these.
After some last-minute changes, including cutting down the map's size in half, the game was finally ready to be released. Almost. See, there was yet another problem. The name Civilization was already licensed by Avalon Hill, who owned the rights to the board game of the same name. To avoid any potential legal issues, Microprose negotiated a license to use the Civilization name, but this agreement was, well, let's just say that it did not make some points clear. But at least for now, everything was fine. The game was released in September 1991, although with very little promotion. But hey, who needs advertisement when you have quality? Sid Meier's Civilization was phenomenal in its own right, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and starting what was known as the golden period of Microprose. Why the golden period? Because the company was starting to slowly crumble, of course. See, as Meier tried to diversify his content, so did Steely. First, he invested a large sum of money to create Microprose's arcade game division, as well as their own graphic adventure game engine. He also experimented with the RPG genre, which led him to the creation of the games Bloodnet and Darklands, receiving mixed reviews. A pretty disappointing turn of events considering that the development cost of Darklands was $3 million. In comparison, Sid Meier's Civilization cost $170,000. And speaking of Sid Meier, he noticed the risky direction Steely was taking and quickly decided to abort the sinking ship. He quietly sold Steely his share of the company and became an independent contractor. And lucky for him, since those stock prices went down faster than CD Projekt's. The arcade division cancelled after 2 games. New engine for adventure games sold to Sanctuary Woods. 40 staff members disposed of. The company later merged with another studio specializing in creating simulation games, Spectrum Holobyte, which led to Steely's resignation as its president. As all of this was happening, Bruce Shelley decided they don't pay him enough to be a part of this shit show, so he too departed, joining Ensemble Studios, where he created his own strategy game called Age of Empires. But some of the Microprose employees couldn't afford to simply change their employer on the spot, as they were far less experienced and, from a company's viewpoint, not as important as Bruce Shelley or Sid Meier. One of those employees was Brian Reynolds, a lead programmer of the ill-fated adventure game division. As he was awaiting the inevitable layoff, he decided to spend his last moments at Microprose productively and started working with Sid Meier on a spiritual successor of Civilization, later known as Sid Meier's Colonization. Now you might ask, why make a spiritual successor if you could just make a sequel? Well, the answer is a bit complicated. See, Sid Meier preferred to work on fresh ideas instead of rehashing old concepts, and he never really made a sequel to any of his games. On top of that, he put everything he could into the first Civilization and didn't really have an idea on what could have been done to further improve it. But from the company's perspective, Civilization was one of their golden geese, and they knew that a sequel would greatly help to overturn the bad financial decisions made by Steely. However, keep in mind that at this point Meier was slowly cutting his ties with Microprose, so he opted to give Reynolds the development lead for creating Civilization 2. And for Reynolds, this was a chance of a lifetime, so he quickly got to work. 5 years after the release of the first game, Sid Meier's Civilization 2 hit the shelves and was quickly hailed as one of Sid's greatest games, even if it wasn't really his. See, though Meier still had some creative input, in reality it was Brian Reynolds who did most of the job on this title. His reward? Involuntary termination of employment. In 1996, the same year Civilization 2 was released, Holobyte Spectrum decided to merge its studio with Microprose, which resulted in massive layoffs. Both Reynolds and Meier were among the fired staff members, but they weren't completely out of luck yet. Along with a fellow now jobless Microprose designer Jeff Briggs, they founded a new company called Firaxis Games. But there was a problem. Microprose still owned the rights to Civilization, which meant that Firaxis Games could not work on a sequel, technically. This did not stop the cunning developers, as they decided that instead of continuing the franchise, why not continue the story of this obviously story-driven video game franchise? And so, we got Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, a direct sequel to Civilization starting exactly where the Microprose games ended. Humanity reached the stars and began colonizing new planets. Since the game was hailed as one of the greatest video games of all time and sold millions of copies, I think it's safe to say that the Firaxis developers had no regrets about their recent choices. However, the same could not be said about Microprose. As we all know, every good story needs a good villain. And what better villain is there in the world of gaming than Activision? This lovely company acquired the rights to the 1980s Civilization board game from Avalon Hill in April 1997 and decided to strike the iron while it was hot. Oh no, not by developing a competing video game series that will bring joy to the players, but by suing Microprose over trademark infringement over the rights to the Civilization name. But as you might remember, there was an agreement made between Avalon Hill and Microprose on this issue. Shit. Now Activision lawyers had to do some logic bending to get what they wanted. So they did. They argued that the agreement with Microprose only extended to the first game in the series and no others, specifically targeting Civilization 2. But Activision did not foresee one thing. Avalon Hill weren't the original publisher of Civilization, it only really brought the game to America. So Microprose returned the favor by buying Hardart Trefoil, the UK company that developed the original board game, and then countersued Avalon Hill and Activision for false advertising, unfair competition, trademark infringement, and unfair business practices. See, this was all a part of Activision's master plan to get the Civilization brand for themselves. In fact, they were already working on a game called Civilization Call to Power, which was supposed to dethrone its Microprose predecessors. But in the end, the case was settled outside the court as both Avalon Hill and Microprose had financial problems at the time and were about to be bought by the same company, Hasbro, so they both had more to lose than gain really. In the end, Microprose kept all the rights to the Civilization brand, Avalon Hill had to pay Microprose $411,000, and Activision acquired a license from Microprose to publish Civilization Call to Power, released in April 1999. The game was marketed as a sequel to Civilization 2, and therefore was highly anticipated, but it didn't really meet those expectations, getting mediocre reviews and ultimately being called one of the greatest video game disappointments in the late 90s. And trust me, that is saying something. But the rights to the series would jump to a different owner yet again as Hasbro Interactive was bought by another company, Infogames. Shortly after acquiring the Civilization brand, they made the most logical decision possible, asked Firaxis Games to make the next number game in the franchise for them. And Firaxis was more than happy to do it. At first, Sid and Briggs wanted Brian Reynolds to be the lead designer as he was the main reason why Civilization 2 was so successful, but he had other plans leaving the company to found his own called Big Huge Games. Jeff Briggs had a few ideas for the sequel, so he was kind of forced to be in charge of this one, as, again, Sid preferred to leave the project to a fresh developer. A lot of new features were inspired by Sid Meier's colonization, most notably different perks each civilization had at the start of each game. Other new ideas had to be cut from the project, such as Great People, though most of them were implemented in the future games. And so Civilization 3 was released by Infogames in 2001, and you know the drill by now. Sold millions, hailed by gamers as the greatest thing ever, all of that stuff. The team later worked on 2 expansion packs, Play the World and Conquests, further increasing their game's lifespan. As they were finishing them, the topic of the next Civilization game came up. One of the developers, Soren Johnson, was particularly interested in the sequel. He wanted to start working on it as fast as possible to get the full development cycle of 2.5 years, as opposed to Civ 3 which only got a year and a half. Of course, as per tradition, Johnson became the lead designer as he seemed to be the most passionate about the project, with Sid Meier and Jeff Briggs playing smaller roles in the development. Civ 4 was really the last game that had problems behind the scenes, and those weren't all that serious either. Halfway through development, the game was dropped by its publisher, Infogames, and sold to Take-Two along with the rights to the entire franchise. This did not stop Johnson. He had faith in his product and, as you can probably guess, it paid off. Yet again, million copies sold, great reviews scored, awards for the Game of the Year taken. From this point onward, Take-Two would hold the rights to the franchise, giving it the proper respect it always deserved. Development on the new games could proceed smoothly, without pesky business people getting in the way. Sure, there were some disagreement, especially once the lead designer of Civilization 5, John Schaffer, decided to abandon square-based gameplay in favor of hexagons, but it's really nothing to write home about. And as soon as work wrapped up on Civilization 5's final expansion, the design team moved on to the next entry in the series. Ed Breach was the new main designer, Firaxis was at the top of their game, and their next title launched without problems. And so, we arrive at the present day. Work on Civilization 6 is slowly nearing an end, as the last expansion packs have been released and the design team can finally rest. But if this story has taught us anything, they probably are already thinking how to top this entry with Civilization 7. And though it had a positive ending, I think that a lesson of this story is a bit bittersweet. Sometimes, though a particular series of events, for example video game releases, may seem perfectly normal and consistent, the people behind these events might face layoffs, debt, or creative problems despite their apparent success. And with that, I wish you all a fantastic day, and I hope to see you next time.